Mythological unification theory, or M.U.T, explained. The mythological unification theory is my completely original work. It is based on years of research into ancient mythology, comparative anthropology and archaeology, comparative symbology, and going out in the field and looking at ancient sites. The mythological unification theory simply states that all mythologies are based on the same gods and goddesses who were real people that came out of ancient Tyre and Crete, possibly between 15,000 and 19,000 years ago. Throughout all of the mythologies, the names will vary per culture, but they are the same people with some variances in their stories and some differences in the pantheons. These gods and goddesses are also the basis of all Abrahamic religions as well as Hinduism. So all of your religions come from the same group of people, which were a family out of ancient Tyre and Crete. All of your secret societies are based on these people. All of the occult workings are based on these people. How did I figure this out? Well, if you go to my website, hiddenhumanstory.com, I've tried to put a lot of information out there, and it is still a work in process, just as my mythological unification theory is still a work in process. What I did is I started off writing children's books. And my children's books, the library kids, were about mythology and history. And when I started to research for these books, I stumbled into some information out of a library called the Loeb Library and a couple other books that began to tell the story of this ancient family. The critical books came from Diodorus Siculus, Nonus, Valerius Maximus, and a couple others like Macrobius and Plato. Now, the key to my mythological unification theory is a murdered son. That is the key. No one else has come up with this theory or figured this out. The murdered son is the key to unraveling this ancient mystery that has been hidden from the public. Throughout many mythologies, there's always a murdered son or something similar. This murdered son of a father god was trying to make the world better and was cut down by jealous rivals or a jealous brother. In the book, The Library History, Diodorus Siculus, Volume 1, page 39, he gives us a very important clue to the mythological unification theory, and it states, "And of the ancient Greek writers of mythology, some give to Osiris the name Dionysus, or with a slight change in form, Sirius. One of them, Eumolpus, in his Bacchic hymn, speaks of our Dionysus shining like a star, with fiery eye in every ray." And he continues on, "Osiris was the first they record to make mankind give up cannibalism, for after Isis did discover the fruit of both wheat and barley, which grew wild over the land, along with the other plants, but was still unknown to man, and Osiris had also devised the cultivation of these fruits, all men were glad to change their food, both because of their pleasing nature of the newly discovered grains, and because it seemed to their advantage to refrain from the butchery of one another." So here is another crucial element, and that is the problem of cannibalism and ignorance all over the planet. Now, these gods and goddesses, I like to use the Greek gods and goddesses as the key. The father god would be Zeus, And there's many generations that came before him that have their story written about, particularly by a Phoenician scholar named Sanchonathan. Now, the Father God Zeus from Greek mythology was one of the main kings of all the gods, and he established his laws. Those familiar with my work know that he had sired a daughter with Demeter named Persephone, and he abducted Persephone and impregnated her. And from that union came Zagreus, a son, who was murdered and cannibalized as a toddler. And that was the impetus to conquer and civilize the world. And what he did was he was able to retrieve the heart of Zagreus. Now, as in all mythologies, there's variations of the story. Some say that he created a potion and drank the heart. Others say he gave it to Semele before he impregnated her. And that is a form of endocannibalism, to take in the soul and essence of a person within the family. And he believed he was able to transfer the soul of Zagreus, who is going to be his only heir of the kingdom, into the body of Dionysus, who came from Semele. And Dionysus was supposed to straighten out the world, which he did. They all traveled, and I proved that out through my work. And Dionysus became the pharaoh Osiris, along with Isis, who is Ariadne. I proved that out in my work. So we know the story of what happened to Osiris. He was killed. The story in Egypt is that his brother, which really would be his cousin, once removed, I believe, conspired with 72 other people and the queen of Ethiopia, and tricked him into a box, sealed it so that he suffocated to death, and they threw it in the Nile. And Isis had to retrieve it, and once she did, she buried it, and Set dug it up and chopped it up, and she had to retrieve it again and hide his body parts and set up a priesthood. And from their union, Isis and Osiris, which, by the way, they had many children, not just one, but Horus is cited as the heir of Egypt, and that would be the Osirian pharaohship, while red-haired Set, who is also Prometheus, set up the red-haired Setian pharaohs, and for quite a while, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms until it united. But this story of the murdered son is common among many of the mythologies. We go into the Nordic mythology. Balder would be the murdered son of Odin, the father god Odin, and he's murdered by the trickery of Loki. So Loki would be Prometheus and Set. And then there's something similar in the Celtic mythology. Now, the Celtic mythology, along with Mesoamerican mythology, is very difficult. It's got multiple versions. You know, there's Celtic, Iberian, and Irish, and Welsh. And I tend to try and go more with the Irish names. And the Mesoamerican, you know, depending on what source you use, there's always a variation of the name and some of the functions. So those are a little tougher to crack. And as I said, you know, my work is constantly being refined as I find new information and, you know, updated. So if you start looking at some of my earlier books, I have tables for these gods and goddesses, and as I find out more information, it varies a little bit. But basically, at this time, I would put an equivalent of Zeus, and we know Jupiter would be the Roman name, Jupiter Sabazius is a Jewish name that the scholar Valerius Maximus tells us that they tried to bring the cult of Jupiter Sabazius into Rome over 2,000 years ago before Christ, and they were kicked out because of it. Odin would be the equivalent in Nordic mythology, Dagda in Celtic, the Jade Emperor in the Chinese. I'm looking at the Polynesian. I still need to do a little more research on that. Enki would be the Sumerian equivalent, and before you balk and quote me Zacharias Sitchin and all that, you need to please be open-minded. I really don't follow his work. There are other scholars like Kramer and Stephanie Daly that tell quite different story. Enki is the equivalent of Zeus. If you look at the story of him having a relationship with his sister Ninhursag and producing a daughter, it's the same thing as the story of Zeus and Demeter having Persephone. And then you look at Enki pursues the daughter because he wants to produce a son. Well, that's the same thing as Zeus going after Persephone and producing Zagreus. And then after that, Demeter is done with him. And that's the same thing in Sumerian, where Ninhursag is done with Enki after that. I'm also toying with the possibility that Cernunnos is Zeus, although it could be Cronus, but Zeus was the stag. I mean, he produced many, many children. In Egyptian, Jeb would be the father of Osiris. Ammon is another name they give to him, although there was a previous Ammon in Egypt. I'm thinking it is Zanagi in Mayan. It's Amna in Japanese. Belos could be another name. They call him Arabian Kronos. They call him a Cronide in the ancient Greek literature because his father was Kronos. Sabazios. For a while I was thinking Mithras, but now I definitely don't, so take that out. I think he may be the equivalent of triple god Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. Indra, definitely. Huitzilopochtli in the Aztec, the sun god. If you look at the Peruvian sun god, Inti, interestingly, Inti, I-N-T-I, very similar to Inki, E-N-K-I. Inti has the thunderbolts, and also Viracocha. He's a Viracocha, although that could apply to multiple gods. Underworld Hades. And those familiar with my work know that Hades, or Pluto, was murdered as a child. And Zeus takes on his name as Underworld Hades to marry Persephone. So that is an interesting twist of a cover-up, even in mythology, because I didn't want to say the father made it with his daughter, and that was a no-no, but he did it. He's Shango possibly also in Santeria. So as I gather more information, my charts tend to change through my books. But it's basically the same key, the murdered son. And you start to, look at the stories, use Greek mythology as your key. The stories of Zeus and Demeter, and Zeus and Persephone, and Zeus and his, against Cronus and the Titans. Zeus had a war against the giants because of what they did to Zagreus. It's the same thing in your book of Enoch, in your Bible. And those familiar with my work know I've already shown you the proof that Zeus is the Abrahamic God. Valerius Maximus states it. He states that the Jews had tried to corrupt Roman values with their cult of Jupiter Sabazius, so the praetor forced them to go back to their home. And that's in his book, Memorable Deeds and Sayings, 1,000 Tales from Ancient Rome. And interestingly, I did find something at the Boston Museum. It was a sculpture of Zeus Sabaeus. There's also the hand of Sabaeus. So there's many clues. They keep the people ignorant of mythology and tell you it wasn't true because they don't want you to know that mythology was true. It's about one family, and it is about this family, the Cronides. It's the basis of all religions. Okay, I want to talk about this guy right here, Prometheus. Those familiar with my work know I've done a lot of research into this, and he's the fire god and the god of arts and crafts. This is Lucifer. He's also Set. I've already shown you in the writings, the ancient writings, that it specifically states that Prometheus was in Egypt trying to set up a kingdom, and he really wasn't a good farmer, and his land flooded, and Heracles had to help him out, creating dams and helping him figure out how to work the water so that his crops would grow. He is the one that set up Dionysus, Osiris. He's Agni, the fire god in Hinduism. He's Loki in the Nordic religion. He has various names. I'm toying with him being Tezcatlipoca in the Aztec because it's an enemy of Huitzilopochtli. It's smoke and mirrors, which, if you know the story of Zagreus, they distracted him with mirrors before they killed him. And smoke is from the fire, and the priest would cover themselves in this like dirty ash, and it would be a tribute to the fire god. So this is another big character, and he had a bloodline. He actually, he had several different wives, and Deculon would be the Greek Noah, and he went up, and his children went up to Syria, so that puts you right up in that area. And he's a trickster. He's the Egyptian Typhon, although there is a different Typhon in Greek mythology that was a titan that went after Zeus. I would equate him with Susanoo in the Japanese. Moloch, Therion, Eshu in Santeria. So there's probably many other names I still have to find. So let's take a look at some of these other gods and goddesses and their equivalents. I've got Apollo here, and he's the sun god, and he's the son of Zeus. And I would equate him with Frey in the Nordic religion. He's also a Viracocha. He was also a god of medicine. So I'm looking at this Dian Cact from the Celtic. Surya in Hindu, Utu Shamash in Sumerian, Belanus in Celtic possibly as well, although I'd like to research that a little bit more. And various other names. He was the twin brother of Artemis. Eventually, believe it or not, in the Nordic and Roman mythology, the two of them actually ended up having a daughter, Aradia, who was the queen of the witches. But they ended up, per this Heimskringla, if you consider Artemis as the equivalent of Phrygia, going up into to Sweden and starting Apollo started a king line there, and it is in Sweden at Gamla Uppsala that he and Artemis are buried. Now, they took Zeus with them, who would be your equivalent of Odin, and it's the story that, Odin wasn't even from that area. He was the Aesir, and he was not Vanir. So you can read a little bit more about that. In the Heimskringla, Odin died, he was cremated, and all of his things. You'll never find his body. But I believe Artemis and Apollo are buried in Sweden at Gamla Uppsala under those mounds. Now here's Artemis, and She was the virgin goddess of the hunt. Um, she would be the equivalent of Freyja. Um, in the Nordic, Bridget. No, I'll take that back. Bridget is really Athena, but she probably has some equivalents in the Celtic. Like I said, I'm still researching it. Sekhmet in Egyptian mythology appears to be her. Diana in Roman. She's one of the goddesses of this witchcraft, along with Wicca, along with Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate. Those would be your main goddesses. Diana, Artemis is the goddess of the moon and the hunt. Now, this next goddess, Athena, was also a virgin goddess. She was the goddess of warfare, but it was intelligent warfare, and she was also a goddess of arts and knowledge. And I am making her equivalent to, obviously Minerva in Roman, Bast in Egyptian, possibly Kali in Hindu, White Buffalo Woman of the Lakota. She would also be Bridget. I actually found some books that stated, I started to delve into that Irish history. She ended up marrying, I think it was King Bree. The Cronides had to go in and stop the sacrifices of children that the Fomorians were doing in Ireland. And they went to war with them, and they were able to defeat them. And she married this evil king and took things over, and then Apollo came back later and killed him. And then she married somebody else and had children with, and started that royal bloodline, which was later, that would be your Tuatha De Danann bloodline. And then later that was taken over by the Molassians, who came in with the Queen Scoda out of Egypt, the pharaonic daughter, and continued on the kings of Tara. So she's another interesting character I'm still working on. As I said, things change as I find more research. Okay, so here is your Dionysus Osiris. Now, he's the key. There's a lot written about him as you start to look at these mythologies. And as I've already shown you in Diodorus Siculus, you can also read about him in Plutarch. He's Osiris. And he married, if you go into, known as the Dionysiaca, he married Ariadne. Ariadne is the famous woman out of the story in Crete of the Minotaur. She was the sister of the Minotaur who helped Theseus kill him and escape with Theseus, but Theseus was going to marry her and took her to an island, I think it was Naxos if I recall, and he abandoned her there and went on his way. And that is where Dionysus Osiris met up with her. And there's variations in the Dionysiaca by Nonus as to what happened. That some say she killed herself, some say she was killed. Others say he married her, and personally I think he married her, and they went into Egypt and reinvented themselves and started up their mission. But if you also get into the Dionysiaca, I mean, it tells the whole story of Dionysus, and he had a few lovers, before he was with Ariadne, and one of them included Aphrodite. He wanted to marry her daughter, but that didn't go. Aphrodite's daughter went to Poseidon. But he was all over the place. He was all over the Middle East. He was in India. He was in Egypt. He was in Greece. I believe he traveled with his father and family over to the Americas. Definitely they were in Ireland. They were setting up kingdoms and queendoms all over the place and teaching their agricultural cults. Now, he is famous for the creation and cultivation of wine, and he used it as a gift, and their knowledge of agriculture, and he converted people mostly through persuasion by giving them this knowledge and teaching them. and that is how they became these gods and goddesses. And there were a couple Indian kings who wouldn't go along, and the famous one is King Darides, and Arantes would be another one, and there was one other guy who wouldn't go along with them, and he ended up killing them with his army. They had to go to war and eliminate the barbaric ways and get the people to accept his ways. So Dionysus Osiris would be the equivalent of Krishna in Hinduism. And you could look at the stories, the Dionysus, like I said, is the reincarnation of Zagreus, if you're following my work. And you'll see him always presented as a child and an adult, just as Krishna is. And Krishna has the flute, which is what Dionysus used as well. And Krishna is killed by a hunter, just as Balder would be killed by an arrow. So here again we have some of the same story. And Balder, he's the equivalent of Balder. He is also Bacchus in Roman, Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec. I believe he's Lono in the Polynesian. I'm researching this Polynesian pantheon. It's a little tougher, but I got to work on that a little bit more. He would also be called Sabazius. Jupiter Sabazius would be his father. He would be Sabazius. M.U.T and Sumerian. M.U.T has an affair with Aphrodite, which would be the Ishtar or Inanna. And there's multiple Aphrodites. I told you that the half-sister of Cronus, Ashtaroth, sometimes gets referred to as an Aphrodite. But this Aphrodite had an affair with would be his half-sister. So M.U.T or Tammuz, Kukulkan in the Mayan, Tsukuyomi in Japanese, Sirius, Io Bacchus, and Viracocha in the Incan pantheon. So, unfortunately, this guy gets murdered off by trickery, and that's what sets off another major family feud and the hatred of Prometheus by Zeus, because Prometheus took part in it and separated out the two pharaonic lines. So there's an Osirian pharaonic line from Dionysus, and there's a Setian pharaoh line from Prometheus. Okay, so here I have Ariadne. Like I said, she's the famous woman from the story of the Minotaur out of Crete. She came out of Crete. King Minos and Pashape were her parents. She becomes Isis, Amaterasu in Japanese, Pele possibly in Hawaiian, Nana in Nordic. She may have an equivalent in Celtic. I'm still looking into that. Rukmini in Hindu. Now, she may have had red hair, she may have had blonde hair, but she ended up wearing black wigs in Egypt. They all did. My understanding is they had lice problems and they would shave their hair and wear these wigs. She's the woman holding the snakes out of Crete. And I've got a picture in here on the bottom left of her and Dionysus from the Vatican. This is a statue. She was famous. She had the sistrum for dance. She cultivated barley and wheat for the Egyptians, just like Demeter did. So those two kind of get confused, but they both did it. Demeter was doing it. Isis was doing it. Some of the other Chronides were doing it in the Middle East. But I want to point out these gods, goddesses tend to all get grouped as the same person. They're not. Okay, they went to different areas. And the other thing you have to keep in mind in mythology is there are different generations using the same names. And usually, the last generation gets all of the stories associated with them. There were multiple Zeuses. There were multiple Hercules. there were multiple Aphrodites, there were multiple Apollos. So you have to get into the story, the written word, not just the mythology and the symbolism. You have to get into this library that they hide from the public to start, picking it down and trying to figure out who was who and what happened. And that's what my work does. It's complex. It takes a while, but there were there were many generations. Zeus was like the last main one with his Olympian children, but there was there's stories with Kronos. There's stories about his father Uranus and mother Gaia, and then there were two other generations in between Gaia and the big mother goddess Tiamat, who we know was murdered off from Sumerian by Anu, and Anu would be the equivalent of Uranus, and he killed off her and her husband. And Tiamat goes into, she's talked about in those Nag Hammadi library. I believe she may be Barbelos, the great mother goddess who kind of got things going. But all of these mother goddesses and gods, they all have their own story. And, because people don't have access to the written stories, that they don't know about it, they're confusing a lot of these. And even in my work, I have to, really work hard to get the story out, as to what happened to these people in their proper generation. Okay, so here's Aphrodite. She was the goddess of love. And her lover was Ares, but she was originally married to Hephaestus and had a son by him. But Hephaestus had a club foot. And that's described in the literature, and she really wasn't attracted to him. She was forced to marry him. But because she had an affair with Ares, he divorced her. And she went up into ancient Iraq and set up a queendom. But she will sometimes get confused with Ashtaroth, who would be the half-sister of Kronos, and it's not the same person. So Aphrodite, Inanna, Ishtar, she had an affair with Dionysus as well. She had many lovers. She had many children. And that was her way. And here's Ares, the god of war. And he had an affair with Aphrodite. But he also had lovers from the Amazon queens and had the famous daughter Hippolytus, I believe her name was. I'm sorry, that was Hippolyta. And she's famous for falling in love with Hercules, but he ends up killing her in a fit of rage, and she dies, and as well as some other Amazons. But Ares was the god of war, and he also sired many children. His cults went into Rome. And then there's Hercules, and he's famous for being from the Argive dynasty, and from that came Perseus. Hercules wasn't that bright, but he was brawn. He was all brawn, and he killed so many people. He ended up killing his wife and his children out of mistake, allegedly, and that's why he ended up doing the 12 labors. He, procreated quite a bit. I mean, had a lot of children. He ended up with 4 wives at the end. At the end, his last wife was Hebe, the half-sister. And he's Gilgamesh from Sumerian mythology. Look at the pictures of him with the lion, because he was so big and strong, he killed him by hand. And then compare it to Heracles or Hercules. Also, he had this amulet. Okay, there's an amulet of Heracles, which is very similar to the hammer of Thor. So I'm going to put that up. Okay, so this is an amulet of Heracles worn by the Romans, and it's a club. Now compare it to the hammer of Thor. It's the same thing. It's the same concept with a little bit of a different design because of the culture. So it's the same person. Now let's talk about Hephaestus. Hephaestus was the god of the blacksmiths, and he married Aphrodite. They had a son, but he had a club foot. He's the son of Hera and Zeus, and she didn't like him because of that club foot, but he was raised by some of the other women. But he was given the beautiful Aphrodite because of the rejection due to his foot, and but that marriage didn't work out. She didn't want to be with him. So he's the god of the smiths. Now let's talk about Heracles or Hermes. Okay, you always see Hermes as a messenger god. He's got the caduceus. He was a writer. He's a messenger god. He's the son of Zeus, and his equivalent to me would be Ganesh in Hindu, and a couple other ones as well. Now he reminds me of the archangel Gabriel, who is a messenger. And as I've already told you, everything is just based off of this Greek mythology. That's the key. The key is the murdered son. I'd consider the archangels. Michael would be Heracles. Heracles, by the way, is the patriarch of Semites, and his war against Amazons. He was trying to kill them off. He didn't want any warrior women. He didn't want women to have any kind of a power position. And that's pretty much with your Abrahamic religions. You know, women are second-class citizens, pretty much. Raphael, I believe, is the archangel of medicine. To me, that would be Apollo. And Ariel almost smacks to me of Athena. So they tend to make these archangels in art very androgynous. I think because they're hiding the fact that it comes from this family, and some of their characters are female and some were male. So, you know, definitely there's a lot of other gods and goddesses I can talk about. I just have given you some of the main ones. As I get into my research, there's, you know, many generations talked about in Sumerian literature, Greek literature, Celtic literature, Nordic literature, Egyptian literature, and then unfortunately a lot of the Mayan stuff was destroyed, but there's still remnants of it, and the Aztecs had some codices, but it's all in there, and they don't teach this stuff in the schools. They want to destroy European history, culture. They don't want you to get back to this, and they don't want you to put these things together to realize that they are frauds, and these priests are basically guilty of crimes against humanity for what they've done to destroy the knowledge of these people and create their own little cults that they benefit from, and their disgusting little rituals that nobody has an understanding of where they come from and why. But like I said, you know, in my work, I get into all of these generations from this great goddess out of the Sumerian, which would be Tiamat, and there was 2 generations, and then came Uranus and Ge, or Gaia, and then Cronus, and then Zeus and his children, and then you get into these demigods. Now, they call them gods and goddesses because of this bloodline out of Tyre and Phoenicia, and you know, there's much to be looked into, but there were other people. There were other people all over Europe that they were coming in and mating with and taking over the royal houses. And in America, I've already shown you, when I went out to Nevada, I found similar type letters to Phoenician letters in the ships that look Phoenician. But all along the East Coast, there's a lot of Celtic influence that may have been from other people that were over in the Americas as well. And then there's a couple other things. I get into the Negritos, getting over into Polynesia and into South America. But this is all hidden. So if you want to learn more, you can read my books. It is a process. It's a lengthy process. I'll do my best to kind of shorten it in these videos and make it as easy as I can. But it takes a lot of time, money, resources to get into this and delve into it. And I just happened to stumble into it because of my interest. But what you have to understand is this mythological unification theory puts together, and all of your mythologies and your religions and a lot of your rituals come from these ancient cronides out of Tyre and Crete, Byblos and all the other places that they spread out to. So that is my original work, the Mythological Unification Theory. Thank you.